Time does not erase deliberate harm. It does not dissolve betrayal or soften what was done with clear intention. Time only buries it beneath routine, disguises it with polite smiles, and waits to see who is patient enough to remember. The people who hurt Samuel Whitaker believed that months would dull his clarity. They believed routine would replace scrutiny. They believed grief and exhaustion would blur the edges of what they had carefully arranged. They were wrong. For 25 years, Samuel Whitaker had built his logistics company from a rented warehouse with 2 trucks and a ledger he balanced by hand. He was not loud about his success. He was steady, disciplined. The kind of man who noticed discrepancies in decimal points and shifts in tone before anyone else in the room sensed them. He trusted slowly, spoke carefully, and kept records of everything. His strength had never been dramatic. It had always been methodical. At home, the same steadiness shaped the rhythm of his family. Helen Whitaker carried herself with quiet composure, her warmth subtle but unwavering. She understood social nuance in ways Samuel never needed to verbalize. She could feel tension in a handshake, hesitation in a compliment. Andrew, their son, had inherited both of them, his father's restraint and his mother's perceptiveness. He watched more than he spoke. He absorbed more than people realized. Their life was not extravagant, but it was dignified. The company paid its employees on time. The mortgage was nearly finished. Family dinners happened without spectacle but with consistency. Stability had been earned through years of discipline. That stability was what made the shift so unsettling when it came. It began with a medical emergency that was serious enough to disrupt routine but not serious enough to threaten permanence. Samuel was hospitalized briefly, sedated longer than he preferred, and advised to rest for several weeks. For a man who believed clarity was responsibility, temporary vulnerability felt unnatural. Yet he accepted it with the same calm he applied to every challenge. Rest was strategic, not surrender. During that window, Charles Whitaker stepped forward. Charles had always been polished, articulate, eager to be seen as dependable. As Samuel's brother-in-law, his presence in the company had been peripheral but familiar. Now his involvement grew noticeably central. He offered structured assistance, temporary oversight, reassurance framed in language that sounded responsible. He spoke of protecting assets, preserving continuity, shielding the family from unnecessary strain. The paperwork arrived during a week when hospital discharge instructions were still scattered across the kitchen table. Documents labeled as precautionary. Temporary authority. Safeguard measures. The language was technical but softened with reassurance. Protection, not transfer. Support, not succession. Helen read carefully but trusted the relational context. Andrew sensed urgency beneath the politeness but lacked proof of misalignment. Samuel, recovering and fatigued, signed what was presented as routine stabilization. What unsettled him was not the content alone but the timing. The signatures were gathered quickly. The explanations were thorough yet slightly rehearsed. Charles emphasized efficiency. He referenced external pressures that required immediate structure. The tone was calm but carried subtle insistence. Something feels off. The thought did not erupt, it settled quietly. Samuel did not confront Charles. He did not question motives aloud. He did not accuse. Instead, he observed. He watched how quickly notifications from banks began redirecting. He noticed small phrasing changes in internal emails. He registered how often Charles used the word stability when speaking to vendors. Helen sensed the shift socially. Conversations became slightly more sympathetic. Compliments toward Charles increased in frequency. Andrew saw suppliers address Charles with a familiarity that felt premature. None of it was dramatic. None of it was openly hostile. It was the quiet rearrangement of perception. Samuel recovered physically with discipline. He resumed early mornings at the office without announcement. He reviewed reports without commentary. He listened more than he spoke during meetings. Charles maintained composure, projecting loyalty and attentiveness. To an outside observer, it appeared collaborative. It appeared responsible. But Samuel had built his life on details. He began requesting archived versions of corporate filings under the pretense of updating insurance documents. He compared dates without drawing attention. He reviewed clauses that he remembered drafting personally years earlier. Subtle additions surfaced, language that expanded temporary authority beyond its stated intention. He said nothing. At home, he remained steady. No anger surfaced at the dinner table. No suspicion disrupted routine. Helen noticed the quiet intensity in his eyes but respected his process. Andrew understood that silence did not mean surrender. It meant calculation. The betrayal was not loud enough to provoke outrage. It was careful enough to appear protective. That was what made it dangerous. It was harm disguised as help, repositioning disguised as responsibility. Charles moved confidently because he believed stress had dulled Samuel's perception. He believed time would smooth over the signatures, normalize the changes, and convert temporary authority into accepted reality. Samuel did not rush to correct him. He began documenting every notification, every adjustment, every date. He reconstructed the week of his hospitalization hour by hour. He reviewed the discharge timeline against filing timestamps. He requested certified copies quietly, never explaining why. His discipline returned not as anger but as focus. Time did not weaken his memory. It organized it. The house remained warm. Helen continued hosting Sunday dinners. Andrew continued assisting with operations. Charles continued smiling, certain that momentum was on his side. Months passed. Routine settled back into place, at least on the surface. They believed stress would cloud his memory. Instead, it sharpened it.
Betrayal rarely announces itself with noise. It hides in ink, in timestamps, in filings no one thinks to question. And when Samuel Whitaker opened the archived corporate record and saw a date that overlapped with his hospital sedation, he understood that this was no misunderstanding. It was intention. The amended filing sat quietly in the state registry, stamped and processed without urgency, as if it had always belonged there. But Samuel knew the architecture of his company the way a builder knows the beams inside his own home, and this document carried weight he had never approved. His signature appeared at the bottom, clean and unmistakable. Yet the structural clauses above it had shifted, widening temporary authority into something far more permanent. Language that once limited oversight to 30 days now referenced indefinite operational discretion. Financial controls that required dual authorization had been softened into single-party approval under extraordinary circumstances. It was subtle, almost elegant in its design. It was also deliberate. Samuel did not react outwardly when he saw it, but something inside him aligned with cold clarity. The fine print expanded access to capital reserves and authorized restructuring under the justification of stability. And stability had been the word Charles repeated most during those fragile hospital days. Bank notifications, once routed exclusively through Samuel's verified email, now flowed through a secondary administrative channel. That channel belonged to Charles. Vendors had begun CCNG Charles as primary contact weeks earlier. And in church gatherings, acquaintances spoke gently about transitions and legacy, as if succession had already occurred. Charles was praised openly for stepping up in a difficult season. And praise, Samuel realized, had been building faster than facts. Helen noticed the tone before she understood the mechanics. Conversations lingered too long on Samuel's health, too confidently on Charles's leadership. Andrew began to see patterns that felt rehearsed. He found his father seated at the dining table long after midnight, old binders open, glasses resting low on his nose, silence thick but composed. Samuel compared timestamps with discharge records, matching hospital logs against filing submissions. The amended document had been processed 12 hours before he regained full cognitive clearance. He reviewed the notary's seal next. The notary office listed had no recorded appointment under his name for that date. His pulse did not rise, but his focus narrowed. Attached to the filing was a medical capacity certification, a document suggesting temporary cognitive impairment requiring structured oversight. The physician listed had examined him only briefly during intake and had not authorized any such evaluation for corporate matters. The attachment was formatted professionally, but the metadata told another story. Samuel printed everything. He placed each document into a thin leather binder he had owned for years, the same binder he once used to draft the company's founding agreements. He began building a private archive. Not out of anger, but out of discipline. He cataloged every change line by line, marking clauses that deviated from original drafts. He traced financial authority adjustments across internal ledgers, mapping small shifts that, together, formed a deliberate redirection of control. He did not confront Charles. He did not ask for explanation. Instead, he observed how confidently Charles moved through the office now, how comfortably he addressed longtime employees as if transition were complete. A confidence, Samuel understood, grows in the absence of resistance. Helen sensed that Samuel had discovered something, though he offered no details. There was no bitterness in him, only a quiet recalibration. Andrew watched his father's restraint and felt both admiration and ache. He understood that silence, in this house, was never weakness. The community's perception continued evolving. Language shifted from temporary support to responsible leadership, and Charles received invitations to speak at industry gatherings on behalf of the company. Samuel allowed it, because truth does not require interruption to survive. At night, he reconstructed the week of his hospitalization minute by minute. Phone records, digital logins, board correspondence, signature authentication trails. He aligned them without urgency, but without pause. What he felt was not explosive anger. It was quiet shock transforming slowly into resolve. He replayed the moment he signed the documents at his kitchen table, the exhaustion, the reassurance in Charles's voice, the gentle insistence that everything was precautionary. He did not blame himself for trusting family, but he did not ignore the evidence now before him. Every altered clause carried intention. Every redirected notification carried preparation. Time had not softened the changes. It had normalized them. Samuel understood something crucial in that realization. Betrayal that hides behind care depends on emotional reaction. If he reacted too quickly, he would confirm the narrative of fragility already forming around him. So he did the opposite. He became steadier. He resumed attending board reviews without reference to amendments. He listened while Charles presented projections that relied on expanded authority. And all the while, the binder thickened. Helen's warmth did not diminish. Andrew's loyalty did not waver. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of family dinners and routine office days, a quiet strategy solidified. Samuel would not contest rumors with emotion. He would answer paperwork with paperwork. Weeks later, while reviewing the final pages of the amended filing, his eyes paused on a clause that had not drawn attention before. It referenced the temporary alignment of assets under a secondary trust, activated in coordination with the authority expansion. The trust name was unfamiliar. It did not appear in any estate document Samuel had ever drafted. He turned the page again, reading slowly. One clause referenced a secondary trust no one in the household had authorized.
Some betrayals are designed to remove you slowly, not violently but quietly, until your own presence begins to feel optional. And when Samuel Whitaker uncovered the secondary holding entity buried inside the amended filings, he understood that this was never about temporary protection, it was about gradual replacement. The trust name was sterile, professional, intentionally forgettable. But its creation date aligned precisely with the week he lay in a hospital bed under monitored sedation. Funds had not vanished in dramatic withdrawals. They had been redirected in modest consulting allocations that appeared reasonable on surface review. Line items were relabeled as strategic advisory expenses. and each payment traced back to an entity that shared a mailing address with Charles's financial associate. Vendor contracts were not terminated outright. They were reassigned gradually, as though efficiency required new oversight. Long-standing suppliers began responding to Charles first. And Samuel noticed that CC lists no longer defaulted to his inbox. There were no accusations. There were no confrontations. There was only the slow rearrangement of authority in rooms where his name used to carry quiet gravity. And isolation began to form not through hostility, but through implication. Invitations to extended family gatherings became less frequent. When they did arrive, they carried an undertone of gentle sympathy rather than inclusion. At church, acquaintances asked about his health before they asked about the business. And the tone carried an assumption that recovery meant retirement. Helen felt it first in the pauses between conversations. People chose their words carefully around her, as though protecting her from a transition already decided. No one accused Samuel of incapacity. But everyone spoke as though his stepping aside was inevitable. Reputation, he understood, does not collapse overnight. It erodes through repeated suggestion. Andrews saw the shift in subtler ways. He noticed how Charles stood slightly closer to board members during community events. He noticed how phrases like stewardship and continuity were used in speeches without direct reference to Samuel. And he began reconstructing timelines on his own, cross-referencing transaction dates with meeting minutes. Samuel did not express outrage. He did not defend his position publicly. Instead, he studied the architecture of what had been built around him. He traced consulting payments month by month, mapping how modest sums accumulated into structural influence. The secondary holding entity controlled specific property rights tied to expansion projects Samuel had negotiated years earlier. And those projects, once finalized, would permanently shift asset leverage. The precision of it unsettled him more than the betrayal itself. Because precision required planning. He scheduled a quiet consultation with Rebecca Langford, an estate attorney known for discretion rather than theatrics. And in her office, beneath neutral lighting and framed legal degrees, he presented the documents without commentary. Rebecca reviewed them slowly. Her expression did not shift, but her questions narrowed. She confirmed that the secondary trust activation required either voluntary transfer or certified incapacity. And the certification attached to the filings did not meet statutory requirements for corporate control modification. Samuel did not smile. But something inside him steadied. Forensic accounting was initiated without announcement. A separate digital archive was created off-site, encrypted and time-stamped. Every altered clause, every payment, every vendor reassignment was catalogued. Andrew assisted quietly, understanding that participation meant protection. Helen remained outwardly composed. But in private moments, she felt the ache of social distancing, the way warmth had cooled without explanation. No one confronted them directly. But everyone behaved as though a transition had already occurred. Isolation without accusation is the most disorienting form of pressure. Because it leaves no clear opponent to challenge. Samuel refused to react emotionally. He understood that anger would validate the narrative of instability. Instead, he attended events calmly. He shook hands without tension. He allowed Charles to speak confidently at community meetings. And he documented every public claim against formal authority structures. The silence was not passive. It was strategic. Weeks passed. Consulting payments continued. Rebecca's forensic team cross-referenced internal metadata with state registry timestamps. Patterns began to surface. The secondary trust documents contained language versions that had not been finalized in Samuel's original drafts. The wording suggested premeditated expansion of authority beyond temporary guardianship. More concerning, several amendments referenced planning discussions dated months before Samuel's hospitalization. Dates that implied preparation long before vulnerability. Andrew reviewed email chains recovered through formal request. Some threads predated the medical emergency entirely. Samuel absorbed this without visible reaction. He did not collapse into bitterness. What he felt instead was clarity forming slowly, like a lens adjusting into focus. This was not opportunism born from crisis. This was a plan activated by crisis. The difference mattered. Helen's grace remained intact, though her trust had been quietly wounded. She understood now that politeness can be weaponized. Yet she also saw in Samuel something deeper than anger. She saw patience that carried purpose. The forensic team delivered preliminary findings in a sealed report one quiet afternoon. Samuel read each page without interruption. And near the end of the analysis, buried in comparative clause review, was the confirmation that changed everything. Document alterations, including trust formation language and expanded authority provisions, had been drafted weeks before the medical emergency occurred. The betrayal had not begun in the hospital. It had been waiting for it. They did not try to push Samuel out loudly, they tried to replace him gracefully. And nothing is more dangerous than a betrayal dressed as stability. Charles began appearing everywhere Samuel once stood. He attended regional logistics conferences as acting representative, his introductions polished and carefully worded. He spoke about continuity, stewardship, and safeguarding legacy. And every sentence subtly implied that Samuel's role now belonged to the past. Civic organizations invited Charles to advisory panels. Local business journals mentioned him as the steady hand guiding transition. The narrative spread without confrontation. It spread because it sounded responsible. The company newsletter featured Charles's photograph more frequently. His tone was measured, respectful, almost deferential to Samuel's foundational leadership. But foundation, Samuel understood, is a word people use when something is no longer active. It is praise wrapped around displacement. Smiles were maintained at board meetings. Handshakes remained firm and courteous. Employees adjusted instinctively, responding to Charles's emails first. And vendors began requesting his approval on contracts that once required Samuel's signature. No one accused Samuel of incompetence. They simply spoke as if his leadership had transitioned naturally. Helen observed the change in social gatherings with calm composure. Conversations referenced the company's future as though Samuel's role was advisory rather than executive. Andrew watched his father sit quietly through meetings where Charles outlined growth projections based on expanded authority clauses. And he saw something remarkable in Samuel's restraint. Samuel did not interrupt. He did not challenge the framing publicly. Instead, he tracked language. He recorded how phrases like operational efficiency replaced shared governance. He noticed how responsibility was described as centralized. He listened to how board members began using Charles's terminology. Rebecca Langford's review reached a critical conclusion during this season of polished transition. The conditional authority activated under Samuel's supposed incapacity exceeded what state fiduciary law permitted. The medical documentation attached to the authority expansion lacked proper certification standards. It referenced evaluation criteria that had never been formally conducted. Rebecca explained this without alarm. But the implication was precise. A breach of fiduciary duty had occurred. And it was embedded inside paperwork that outwardly appeared compliant. Samuel absorbed the information without visible emotion. Because outrage would serve the narrative being built around him. Instead, he increased his documentation rhythm. Every board meeting was summarized privately with timestamps and exact phrasing. Every public statement Charles made was cross-referenced against corporate bylaws. Every decision executed under expanded authority was catalogued. He did not defend his position publicly. He allowed the performance of stability to continue. That performance grew more elaborate by the week. Charles announced strategic partnerships tied to consulting allocations Samuel had already traced to the secondary holding entity. The business press framed these developments as modernization. And modernization is a word that quietly erases origin. Employees adapted to the tone shift. Some out of loyalty, some out of uncertainty. Samuel treated them with the same measured steadiness he always had. He refused to let suspicion poison the culture he had built. At church, Charles was introduced during a community breakfast as a model of leadership in challenging seasons. And applause followed politely. Helen felt the ache of that applause but did not show it. Grace, she understood, is strongest when it refuses bitterness. Andrew watched his father closely during those gatherings. He saw no tremor in his composure. But he also saw the sharpened focus in his eyes. Samuel was not withdrawing. He was studying the architecture of replacement in real time. Rebecca's team prepared a structured memo outlining fiduciary inconsistencies. It stopped short of formal accusation but identified procedural violations clearly. Samuel chose not to submit it yet. Because timing determines whether truth is heard or dismissed. The narrative of responsible transition continued to circulate. Charles positioned himself as the guardian of continuity, never once speaking ill of Samuel. That restraint was strategic. It preserved the illusion of unity. Yet beneath the surface, financial authority remained improperly expanded. And the conditional transfer clauses remained active. Samuel understood that exposure without preparation would fragment the company. So he prepared. He reconstructed board discussion sequences, identifying moments where expanded authority was referenced without formal vote. He documented who nodded, who hesitated, who remained silent. He tracked banking permissions line by line. And he waited. Weeks later, during routine quarterly reconciliation, a discrepancy surfaced in the company's internal ledger. It was modest in appearance but inconsistent in classification. The transaction referenced consulting disbursement tied to a capital reserve reallocation. And the amount exceeded discretionary limits outlined in the original bylaws. Samuel forwarded the documentation to Rebecca without commentary. She escalated it through formal compliance channels. 2 days later, a banking compliance officer requested clarification regarding authorization authority tied to the transfer. The inquiry was procedural, neutral, automatic. But it carried weight. Because compliance questions do not bend to narrative. They respond only to documentation. Charles remained confident publicly. He assured board members that the inquiry was routine. Samuel said nothing. He attended the next meeting with the same calm expression he had worn for months. But for the first time, the performance of stability showed a fracture. And a banking compliance officer had flagged a transaction that could not be quietly dismissed. They thought paperwork could bury the truth deep enough that no one would ever dig. But the moment the compliance inquiry was formally triggered, the ground beneath their quiet strategy began to shift. The request from the bank's compliance officer was procedural on the surface, framed as routine verification of authorization thresholds. Yet routine reviews do not ask questions unless something fails to align. Samuel read the notice slowly, not with alarm but with recognition. Because this was the first institutional thread that did not rely on narrative, loyalty, or perception. Compliance does not care about reputation. It cares about documentation. Rebecca Langford responded within hours, formally requesting internal communication logs tied to the flagged transaction. And once a legal request is submitted, silence becomes evidence. Charles maintained composure publicly, describing the inquiry as standard auditing. But the tone inside the office shifted, subtle and electric. Internal emails were preserved under legal hold. Archived threads once considered irrelevant were suddenly part of a timeline. Metadata revealed more than intention ever could. Draft versions of consulting agreements existed weeks before Samuel's hospitalization. Timestamp analysis showed edits made late at night, revised clauses that expanded authority beyond what board minutes reflected. And digital footprints traced those revisions back to a login associated with Charles's private device. There were no explosive revelations. Only accumulation. The Shell consulting entity, once masked as advisory support, was now linked through tax identification numbers to a partnership partially controlled by Charles. And that connection was not disclosed in board disclosures. Rebecca compiled the findings without emotional commentary. Her memorandum read like a quiet unraveling. Tax discrepancies emerged next. Consulting payments categorized under operational optimization were deducted in ways inconsistent with company bylaws. Samuel did not express anger when he reviewed the summary. What he felt instead was confirmation. The manipulation had not been reckless. It had been layered. Helen sensed the gravity without needing the specifics. She saw the weight in Samuel's posture, not of defeat but of resolve. Andrew assisted Rebecca's team by cross-referencing board approval dates against payment releases. He understood now that patience had been his father's greatest defense. There was still no public accusation. There was still no confrontation. Instead, Samuel made his next move quietly. He restructured the primary family trust, not to retaliate but to protect. Assets were reallocated under stricter dual authorization requirements. An independent co-trustee was appointed, someone with no relational ties to Charles or extended family. Governance safeguards were drafted with language that left no room for conditional expansion. These actions were executed without announcement. Because protection does not require spectacle. Charles continued attending meetings as though nothing had shifted. He spoke confidently about growth projections, unaware that the architecture beneath his authority was being reinforced against him. Rebecca's formal findings reached the board chair in sealed correspondence. And the chair, bound by fiduciary responsibility, could not ignore what documentation clearly outlined. There were no raised voices. There were no accusations in hallways. But there was movement. Board members began reviewing bylaws with renewed attention. Financial oversight committees requested updated reports. The atmosphere did not explode. It tightened. Samuel remained steady in every interaction. He greeted Charles with the same measured civility he had always shown. That composure unsettled more than anger would have. Because anger can be dismissed as instability. Steadiness cannot. Andrew watched the long game become visible in subtle shifts, how Charles's proposals now faced procedural review, how compliance officers asked clarifying questions during presentations. The narrative of seamless transition began to fracture quietly. Rebecca's final audit summary concluded that expanded authority had been activated without meeting statutory medical certification standards and without full disclosure of related party financial interests. The language was restrained. But the implications were undeniable. Samuel did not celebrate this moment. He did not frame it as vindication. He understood something deeper: truth does not need volume to prevail. It needs structure. Helen's grace deepened during this season. She chose not to withdraw socially, even as whispers recalibrated. She met acquaintances with warmth, not defensiveness. And in doing so, she preserved the dignity that others had tried to erode. The board chair formally scheduled a comprehensive review session to address compliance findings and governance concerns. Attendance would be mandatory for all stakeholders. Charles received the notice with professional acknowledgement. But the confidence that once carried him through every room now felt slightly measured. Samuel read the meeting agenda without visible reaction. He had not rushed this process. He had allowed documentation to speak before emotion. He had allowed systems to respond before confrontation. And now the long game was no longer invisible. A mandatory disclosure meeting was scheduled with all stakeholders present. They believed the meeting would finalize his quiet removal. They did not realize it would finalize their exposure. The boardroom carried its usual stillness, polished wood reflecting morning light as though nothing historic was about to unfold. But beneath that calm surface, documentation waited to speak louder than any accusation ever could. Charles arrived composed, tailored suit pressed, posture confident but measured. He believed procedure would favor the narrative already circulating: stability, transition, responsible leadership. Board members gathered with professional courtesy. Yet the compliance memorandum resting in each folder had already shifted the tone before anyone spoke. Samuel entered without spectacle, carrying nothing but a slim binder he had assembled over months. His presence was steady, not defensive, not theatrical. Helen had encouraged him before he left the house, not with strategy but with grace. Because dignity does not require volume. Rebecca Langford began the session with formal acknowledgement of fiduciary obligations. Her voice remained level, structured, disciplined. She did not accuse. She presented chronology. The forensic report unfolded page by page, mapping the sequence of filings, edits, and authorizations with precise timestamps. Each date aligned against hospital discharge records, corporate bylaws, and statutory requirements. Signature validation analysis appeared first. The document bearing Samuel's signature had been scanned from a previously executed template and digitally embedded into a revised draft. The metadata revealed the insertion date. And that date did not align with the physical signing session described in board minutes. No one interrupted. Because facts leave little room for improvisation. Rebecca continued with medical certification review. The attached capacity document lacked required evaluative criteria and did not meet state standards for corporate authority modification. The physician listed had provided no formal incapacity declaration. And the certification language exceeded the scope of the brief hospital assessment. Silence deepened, not from shock but from realization. Because professional environments absorb truth differently than emotional ones. Financial diversion mapping followed. Consulting payments categorized under operational optimization were traced directly to a holding entity partially controlled by Charles. Disclosure requirements for related party financial interests had not been fulfilled. Board approval documentation did not reference the affiliation. Charles maintained composure as long as chronology spoke in abstract terms. But when digital login records tied document revisions to his private device, the room shifted. Samuel did not look at him. He kept his attention on the documents. There were no raised voices. There were no accusations delivered with anger. Rebecca concluded with a summary that framed the issue as breach of fiduciary duty and improper activation of conditional authority under insufficient medical documentation. Her tone never sharpened. The board chair requested clarification on disclosure compliance. Rebecca responded with statutory references. Charles offered explanation in measured language, describing the revisions as administrative oversight during a stressful period. But oversight does not explain predated drafts. Samuel remained silent throughout. His silence was not weakness. It was confirmation. The board recessed briefly for internal review. And during that pause, something subtle but irreversible occurred. Perception recalibrated. When the session resumed, the chair outlined immediate procedural actions. Expanded authority granted under questionable certification would be suspended pending formal review. Financial transactions linked to related party entities would undergo independent audit. And temporary governance would revert to original bylaws until resolution. Charles did not argue. Because argument would fracture what little stability remained. Samuel did not celebrate. Because vindication without grace corrodes integrity. The authority shift happened without applause. It happened through motion, through vote, through institutional structure reclaiming its own standards. Helen waited at home, not anxious but prayerful in her own quiet way. Andrew sat in the back of the boardroom, witnessing something deeper than victory. He saw that truth, when documented patiently, does not need force. It needs endurance. Rebecca concluded the meeting by outlining regulatory reporting obligations triggered automatically by identified fiduciary breaches. Those obligations required formal disclosure to external oversight bodies. The board chair acknowledged the requirement. And once acknowledged, it could not be reversed. The atmosphere remained composed. But the implications were final. Samuel closed his binder slowly, not with triumph but with completion. He had not raised his voice once. He had not defended his reputation publicly. He had allowed time to answer. Charles gathered his documents carefully, posture still upright though the certainty that once carried him had diminished. No humiliation occurred. Only accountability. As the room emptied, the compliance officer confirmed that regulatory reporting would be submitted within mandated timelines. External review processes would begin automatically. Samuel stepped outside into late afternoon light, breathing evenly. There was no bitterness in him. Only relief that structure had prevailed over narrative. Inside the boardroom, documentation remained on the table, quiet, undeniable. And regulatory reporting automatically triggered an external investigation that no one in that room could quietly dismiss. They expected outrage when the truth surfaced. What they received instead was procedure. The regulatory filing moved forward without hesitation, and once the external review began, momentum no longer depended on opinion. Institutional processes replaced speculation, and documentation replaced narrative. Assets connected to the flagged transactions were frozen pending formal review. There were no dramatic seizures, no public announcements, only quiet notifications delivered through official channels. Temporary authority granted under the questionable certification was formally suspended. And with that suspension, control returned to the structure originally written years earlier by Samuel's steady hand. Fiduciary removal was executed through board vote, recorded cleanly in minutes that would outlast gossip. The language was measured, citing compliance breaches rather than personal failure. A civil investigation initiated automatically once statutory thresholds were met. It did not accuse with emotion, it examined with precision. Charles's influence narrowed almost overnight. But there was no public humiliation campaign. The community, which had once embraced the narrative of transition, adjusted with equal quietness. Because perception shifts quickly when documentation becomes undeniable. At church gatherings, conversations softened again. Not with pity this time, but with recognition. Samuel declined interview requests from local business publications seeking comment on the governance review. He did not frame the outcome as vindication. He described it, when asked privately, as correction. And correction does not require applause. Helen continued attending community events with the same grace she had always carried. She did not distance herself from those who had once spoken cautiously around her. Instead, she met them with warmth that carried no bitterness. Because forgiveness, she believed, protects the heart more than resentment ever could. Andrew observed everything closely. He saw how discipline had preserved dignity when anger could have fractured it. He watched his father return to the office each morning not as a man reclaiming territory but as a steward restoring balance. There was no dramatic speech to employees. Instead, Samuel addressed the team with clarity about procedural corrections and renewed governance standards. He thanked them for their professionalism during uncertainty. He did not mention betrayal. He did not reference personal hurt. The civil investigation continued in the background, structured and methodical. Consulting entities were reviewed, tax classifications examined, disclosures assessed. Charles cooperated formally, his confidence now replaced by careful restraint. There was no spectacle, no shouting, no public condemnation. Accountability unfolded through systems designed precisely for moments like this. And systems, unlike emotion, do not seek revenge. Reputation recalibrated across the community gradually. Articles that once praised transition now referenced governance reinforcement. Business partners expressed renewed confidence in the company's oversight mechanisms. Investors responded to transparency with steadiness. Samuel felt neither triumph nor bitterness. What he felt was closure forming quietly. Helen saw that closure not in words but in the way he slept more peacefully. The tension that had once tightened his shoulders began to ease. Andrew understood that the real lesson had never been about exposure. It had been about endurance. There were moments when Samuel could have chosen retaliation. He could have pursued public embarrassment or leveraged community opinion. But he chose structure over spectacle. Because spectacle satisfies ego, structure protects legacy. In private reflection, he acknowledged the grief of misplaced trust. He allowed himself to feel disappointment without letting it harden into resentment. Grace, he understood, does not excuse wrongdoing. It prevents wrongdoing from redefining you. The investigation's preliminary findings confirmed fiduciary breaches and improper related party disclosures. Corrective actions were recommended and implemented without resistance from the board. Charles's formal removal from fiduciary responsibilities was documented and archived. He retained no authority within the company. Yet Samuel did not erase him from family gatherings entirely. He allowed space for accountability without permanent exile. That decision surprised Andrew more than any legal victory. Because forgiveness, when chosen deliberately, is stronger than retaliation. Weeks passed, and routine returned not as denial but as restoration. Employees focused on operations rather than rumors. Clients renewed contracts with confidence in oversight. Community perception settled into respect for procedural integrity. Samuel visited Rebecca one final time to review post-investigation safeguards. He thanked her not with praise but with acknowledgement. Documentation had done its work. Time had done its work. And justice had unfolded without spectacle. One evening, as the family gathered quietly at home, Samuel reviewed a final set of governance revisions. He did not speak of victory. He spoke of protection. Andrew sensed that something permanent was about to change, not in reaction to betrayal but in response to wisdom earned. Because protection, unlike punishment, looks forward. Samuel closed the folder slowly. And in that quiet motion, he made one final structural decision to protect the family permanently. They thought the story would end when the investigation closed. They were wrong, because the real ending was never about exposure, it was about preservation. When the final compliance reports were filed and corrective measures completed, Samuel did not return to the past. He turned his attention to the future with the same steady discipline that had carried him through betrayal. The business was placed into an irrevocable multi-layer trust designed to outlast personality and prevent opportunism. And this time, every clause was written with precision sharpened by experience. Dual authorization requirements were embedded permanently into financial governance. No single individual would ever again hold conditional control without independent oversight. An annual independent audit became mandatory, not optional. Transparency would no longer depend on trust alone. Samuel did not implement these changes in anger. He implemented them in clarity. The trust structure separated operational authority from ownership protections, creating balance between leadership and accountability. Because power without structure invites temptation. Helen reviewed the final documents beside him at the dining table where months earlier the first papers had been signed under strain. This time there was no pressure in the room, only intention. A charitable allocation was established quietly in the family name, dedicated to supporting small business ethics education and governance literacy. Samuel believed prevention was more powerful than punishment. He did not remove Charles from the family entirely. He allowed legal processes to conclude with measured consequence. Structured civil penalties were applied according to statutory guidelines. There was no vengeance attached to them. Charles faced accountability through institutions, not humiliation through spectacle. And that distinction mattered. In private reflection, Samuel acknowledged the pain of betrayal without letting it define his legacy. He did not excuse what had been done. But he chose not to carry resentment into the next chapter of his life. Because resentment binds the wounded to the wound. Andrew watched his father's decisions unfold with quiet admiration. He understood now that remembering is not the same as retaliating. Time had revealed every inconsistency, every hidden clause, every premature draft. And yet Samuel's victory did not feel like conquest. It felt like restoration. The company stabilized not because scandal erupted but because governance matured. Employees sensed the difference. Community respect returned not through apology campaigns but through consistency. Reputation rebuilt itself quietly on structure rather than perception. Helen moved through social circles with renewed ease. She carried no bitterness in her tone. Her strength had never depended on dominance. It had always rested in dignity. Samuel often reflected on the months of silence when the narrative of transition had nearly overtaken him. He recognized now that silence had not been surrender. Silence had been preparation. Documentation had not been obsession. It had been protection. Timing had not been hesitation. It had been power. He did not romanticize the experience. He acknowledged the grief of misplaced trust openly within his family. Yet he also recognized the unexpected grace within it. The ordeal had clarified what mattered most: structure, patience, and integrity. Andrew absorbed the lesson deeply. He understood that anger reacts, but patience reorganizes. The family gathered one quiet evening to review the final trust documents, not with ceremony but with gratitude. The dining table felt different now. It no longer carried the weight of vulnerability. It carried the steadiness of restoration. Samuel closed the final binder with calm certainty. He had not erased what happened. He had preserved what mattered. Time, he realized, does not erase deliberate harm. It preserves evidence for those patient enough to collect it. The betrayal that once felt like erosion had become instruction. The silence that once felt isolating had become strategy. And the pain that once threatened dignity had matured into wisdom. There were no dramatic reconciliations. There were no emotional speeches delivered to extended family. There was only steady continuity. And in that continuity, dignity was restored. Samuel understood something universal in the end. People often assume that if they wait long enough, memory fades. But memory does not fade when it is anchored in truth. It sharpens. Time had not worked against him. It had worked with him. The systems he rebuilt would outlast personality and protect generations beyond his own. That was the real answer to betrayal. As the house settled into evening quiet and Helen turned off the kitchen light, Andrew looked at his father not as a man who had won but as a man who had endured. And endurance, he realized, is a quieter form of strength. They believed time would erase what they had done. They misunderstood time. It had been keeping the record.